Okay. So we, since the weather messed up travel plans, and yeah, come on in because you're gonna. This is we have Susan and Ann. Ann is the one right there. She's a owner at DHM, and Susan is our kind of workhorse on this in the dark hair. She's been helping a lot. Actually, the way that we have this arranged, just so you know how we're operating here, we have Todd, who lives and works in Denver, and then my shop is in Durango, and so is the DHM shop. So we've got them on video conference here, and I think Todd is probably going to call in at some point. Because we have so much going on right now with the comprehensive plan, the zoning code, and the design guidelines, I know you've seen a lot of me in the last while, but I'm going to continue to run the meetings in person. And so we're going to kind of do this for most of these. We have 3 of these actually for the design guideline update. We have 4, or maybe I think we have 4 for the zoning code. And there's a clock on this thing. We have to be done by the end of June, which is good. It's difficult because it's a lot to absorb in a short amount of time, but it's also really good. So they're on here, and there's a little mic here, and they can hear pretty well. But you know, if you have something to say, just speak up. And then they're on my speaker here. I have this mic plugged into it, and so you know, hopefully you can hear them when they speak, because we'll kind of switch off here and there. But I'm going to go through this, and sort of what we're doing tonight is going through what our approach, given what we learned during the comprehensive plan, what we've learned so far with the zoning code process, and a very thorough review of the design guidelines. Spent a lot of time looking at those. Susan went through them. She's very detail-oriented. She went through them with a fine-tooth comb. We thought a lot about what's in there versus what we're trying to do strategically. And so the purpose of this presentation is to sort of unload an outline for how we want to go about revising them. And there are several discussion and decision points along the way. And because so many people were not able to show up tonight, they're actually recording this in Durango. So we can at least, it'll be a huge file, but we can at least post it and have people that couldn't make it can have the ability to listen to what was said and submit comments, their thoughts some other way. So we have that at least. I want to, okay, I'm afraid to close anything on here because I'm afraid I'm going to lose the presenters here. This is actually their subscription, so I cannot turn anything off. So, oh, we just lost somebody. Are you guys still there?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm sorry.
We have a little bit of a delay. It's just we're muting ourselves when we're not talking so that you don't get any background noise.
Okay, that's fine.
Likewise for me, Gabe. Hi, everybody.
Hey, that's Todd. Okay, so they're muting. It's amazing, and Todd pointed this out the first time, is that your city charter, which is your constitution, basically, for City of Central, right at the beginning talks about historic preservation. And none of us have ever seen that before in a municipal charter. I mean, historic preservation goes that deep in this city that when the people that were writing the charter wrote it, it's right up front. So it's incredibly important, and we know that, we've learned that, but that just kind of proves the point. And there's a National Historic Landmark area, and here's the map that we have right now. There might be some slight changes to this map, very slight. But this is the map that's actually in the design guidelines that has been used for a long, long time. And we're going to be able to replicate this map in our GIS mapping and modernize the mapping for the design guidelines, right? So that'll be handy. You have more than just Xeroxed, multiple Xeroxed copies of the maps. But this is really where we're concerned about with historic design, with the design guidelines.
So just before you move on, one important point with that is that's the National Historic Landmark District boundaries, and includes Central City, Blackhawk, and Navajo, parts of all three jurisdictions, the 2 cities in the county. So what we're looking at is codifying that boundary as the design boundaries that would be subject to these rules, and it would not be design requirements outside that boundary. So just to clarify, this part would just be within that district boundary.
And it's enough to fight off as it is inside that area in Central City. It's a big responsibility. And there's obviously a really good reason for why we go about that, why we go about this, and that is to preserve historic structures and historic sites. The thing that makes this place unlike any other. That's why we do it. And the Belvedere is a great example of a property that the community has taken responsibility for that was fallen on hard times, right? So it was time to do something with that. In the current design guidelines, and a lot of this project is sort of taking the current design guidelines apart, thinking about where we're headed from a strategic direction, and putting them back together. I mean, that's ultimately what this project is. And so we don't want to overcomplicate that component of it. But it's also in and of itself quite a project. So the goal of the current goals and objectives for the historic district coming out of the design guidelines, obviously the primary goal is to preserve the integrity of the National Historic District. And then there's another goal, which is another primary goal, which is to preserve the integrity of all surviving historic contributing structures and sites. So that, I think, is really important. The other component is that new construction reinforces the historic character of the district, right? So those are, and that's something that we're going to talk about tonight. That third one is something that is not super clear. So when we get to it, you'll see why we're going to talk about that more. But we have a lot of challenges that we've uncovered in this process, both through discussion and from our own evaluation as consultants. Probably the biggest challenge is the potential loss of these structures because of basically demolition due to neglect. If there's not people in the structures taking care of them, they're going to fall down. They just aren't going to last forever. Another problem is that the design guidelines are not that clear and they're difficult to use. So that's another big challenge that we've come up with. Welcome.
Hi.
We're just getting started here. So sorry we're late. That's okay.
Sorry.
That's okay. And it was uphill all the way. Make yourself at home. We're just getting to the good part, which is the challenges. So the challenges are basically the fact that if we don't get the structures occupied and get people inside of them and taken care of them, they're going to fall down. That's just, we know that's true. We've watched it happen, right? Another challenge is that the existing design guidelines are just kind of difficult to use. They're long, the heart is in them, but in terms of user-friendly, they don't have that going for them. Another problem with them is the process, the number of steps that an applicant has to go through to do what should be relatively simple, straightforward kind of maintenance on a home. So without regard to the outcomes that we're looking for, what the purpose of the review process is, the review process itself is kind of a challenge right now. And then there's this challenge of trying to figure out whether with new construction, additions, kind of rehabilitation / additions to existing historic structures, how do we sort of reconcile the direction of, are we trying to do historic replication, or are we trying to meet some modern demand? And so, you know, the term there is infill. Infill is basically you have a vacant lot in between historic structures, a new structure that would go on that, potentially utilizing the rest of a lot that might have a historic structure on it, a lot that's not currently entirely utilized, or a structure that is non-contributing and needs to be blasted down and replaced with something else. So that's what we mean by infill. And that in the sort of existing plat, it's not necessarily platting new lots and developing new neighborhoods, it's about infill of the existing town. So those are some of the challenges, and with those challenges in mind, and just if you want to have any comments, please just stop me. I'm going to keep rolling. We have a lot to make it through, but if you have something on your mind, we certainly, that's what we're here to talk about. So today's goals are keep the existing historic structures intact by getting them occupied, essentially. Another kind of component of that is think about modernizing and maintaining structures for sustainability. So better weatherization, making it easier for people to upgrade their historic homes so that they can meet the sort of modern energy demands, the modern lifestyle, and last longer. And that can be within a framework. So we're going to go through, you know, a bunch of more specifics on what that means. And kind of alongside of this is balancing Victorian era preservation with modern demand. So, yeah, you know, there's a real estate market out there. There's people that want certain things, and obviously, if they're buying a historic home here in Central City, or they already own one, that's part of what they want. But there may be some other things that they want that aren't exactly Victorian era. So we have to think about reconciling those. And we have a lot of questions about that. So do you think that these goals, given what we've talked about with the existing goals, sort of represent where we want to head here strategically with this?
Sounds like a plan to me.
Sound okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Then you've opened the door for me to continue on. Currently, there are 9 steps for any project basically in the district, and they all involve going to the Historic Preservation Commission, except for paint colors and gutters. So paint colors and gutters have been managed at a staff level. Everything else that you want to do, change your windows, put a new door on, all that goes through Historic Preservation Committee. So that's a public meeting and the scheduling of that and all that. So that's today. What we propose is, and we don't, you know, Todd is actually here. If he was unmuted, he would say, you know, with regulations, you don't start with procedures. But in this case, we do want to kind of bring procedures to the forefront because of what the end goal is. The end goal is that historic structures get maintained so they don't fall down. That's kind of, to me, like goal number one that we talked about.
And Gabe is absolutely right. I would say it.
All right, so he got his second. I'm glad I don't have to get into a debate with Todd because I would probably lose. But so in this case, we bring it right up front because we want to think about how difficult or how easy it is. So first of all, in the land use code, right, we've got the design guidelines over here. We have the land use code here. The land use code needs to be very clear about what development applications where are required to comply with the historic design guidelines that will go through the Historic Preservation Officer or HPC. That needs to be super clear up front because a lot of things don't need to go through it. For example, things that are outside the historic district don't go through this process, right? So new annexations, things up on top of the parkway, not part, that's addressed in the zoning code, in the land use code. It's not a free-for-all by any stretch. The land use code addresses all of that, but we need to be very clear at the outset. Here's what actually gets reviewed under the design guidelines. And one of the things that we think that should be not reviewed under design guidelines is landscaping, plants, that sort of thing. You'll see we have a note about yellow roses in the house. Okay, so that's the one exception. But in terms of what you plant in your yard, we just don't want to necessarily get into that business.
I have a question. Years ago, I wanted to cut some trees down that were affecting my garage and my carriage house, and I had to go through the city to get approval to cut them down. Is that true now, or is that part of landscaping?
Ray can answer that question.
Technically, landscaping so change of pruning with required.
So we're saying we're not messing with that anymore. We're giving that one up. All right? So I don't know how you feel about that, but that's what we're suggesting. And that landscaping actually is addressed in the code. Right? So if you're building something new, there's landscaping requirements. We're going to talk about wildfire hazard in the code and more about what kind of vegetation we don't want up against your house versus vegetation that we do want. There's a section in the code about ridgeline ordinance where if your new structure breaks a visible ridgeline, that you might screen that with landscaping. Well, we have to reconcile that with wildfire hazard, which is serious business. So that all gets addressed in the code, right? Not in the design guidelines. Also, the walls and steps are an iconic part of Central City. But walls and steps that are not visible from a public road or a public right-of-way become something that the land use code handles, not the Historic Preservation Committee or Commission or the HPO. They don't go through. If it's not something that you can see from the street, if it's a stairway that gets you from your back step, from your back porch up to your outbuilding, and nobody can see it, that's something that the land use code handles, not the design guidelines. How are we with that?
That's a great idea.
Giving it up. We're giving up some things here at HPC. Let it go. Okay, so then there's another component of this where we want to grant more authority to the Historic Preservation Officer, which today is Ray, that currently is reviewed under the full HPC. So we have a list here of things that we think, with the proper standards, right? This is a caveat because in order to be able to do this, in order to say, okay, Historic Preservation Officer administratively will review these things, HPO needs some standards that makes that a doable, he needs less sort of vague judgment calls in order to review these things.
Well,
Clear standards.
One of the things we have big time problems are windows and doors.
Yeah.
I mean,
How many meetings have you sat through for windows and doors?
lots.
And was it worth it?
Yes.
It was.
Oh, yeah.
I would listen.
I thought.
Can you elaborate?
Well, because of some of the things that they wanted to use, and we found different other things that was just no. This didn't have a window there. It didn't have a door there, and you have to kind of let's go through all this again.
So if we say, okay, it's, we have this in here, we have maintenance in kind replacements. So if you have like a 12-pane window that's made out of wood, and this is what size of panes they are, and somebody comes in with 12-pane window that meets those standards, what we're suggesting is that the staff could make that determination. We're not giving it up. We're not saying, okay, put whatever door you want, put whatever window you want. We're just saying, okay, you don't have to go to a full-blown Historic Preservation Commission meeting to do that. Paint colors, gutters, and then we actually call out specifically projects that could disturb existing yellow roses and or hopspots. So we include that. Now I don't know. Do we want to include that? Do we want to be in that business? It seems like we do, but I don't.
How do you feel about the fences?
Yeah, the fencing is in. We don't know where to put that. Whether we say HPC reviews the fencing or Historic Preservation Officer reviews it. That's why it's in red. That's a question.
So my sense of the fencing regarding the project is, if someone comes in and they want to do the fencing, and then the guidelines are already thrown out, and if they're meeting those guidelines, it would be very simple for staff to say, yes, if you're looking for French pocket, and you can type of teach it, and just keep it then, or keep it very quickly, especially over the camera, versus delaying in a month or two. I think that can be done very quickly, so at most time for fencing. One question I would like the agency's input on the logos and pop-up. Those are kind of going out as suggestions. I don't know if we really have a feeling whether we should be involved in landscaping at all. You could say, no, we're not involved in any landscaping, or do you see some value in that? That was just
Now, when you talk about landscaping, is that patios and decks and stuff? Well, it is part of landscape. That's what I'm asking. What are they including in that landscape?
So would it be like the walkways, the plantings?
So decks, I think we need to put some more decks and patios in a different place and put that out there.
Where would that
I would say it would have to come before the commission.
I don't know, team. What do you think about decks and patios, remote team? DHM.
I think I'm going with if your deck or your patio is in your rear yard and not visible from the public walkway or roadway, that you don't need a review.
But if
If
they
you're
are,
adding a new front porch or deck or patio, if that's even appropriate, on the front of your house and it is seen from the public right away, then it does need to be administratively or potentially reviewed by the commission.
because lately we have had quite a few reviews for different types of decks and that they wanted to change things and, so that's what I'm saying.
So I think a deck that's structural would definitely fall under the design guidelines, but a patio that's ground level,
Yeah, that's, I can, yeah.
that to me is a gray area. But if it's visible, it comes into that sort of component of maybe we do, it becomes part of the walls and steps. And so we just need to maybe find the line. But if it's not visible from a public right-of-way, Yeah.
Largely because they didn't get it.
But the latest ones, they were very visible, they're right on the street.
Yeah. Okay, so we noted.
So, Gabe, this is Todd. To echo DHM, if you're changing the appearance of the structure from the street, it should go to review, and it should be HPC review, it seems to me.
Hold on just one sec.
Yeah. I think we can, yeah, I would take the first.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay. All right, just to catch everybody up, we're not worried about the roses and hop vines. So that's not part of design guidelines. But Todd, you were in the middle of talking about the patios and that sort of thing.
Yeah, if you're doing an in-kind replacement, I think is the way that DHM put it, or if you're replacing or repairing materials in an existing deck so that it looks the same, that should be HPO approved to ensure that that's exactly what you're doing. But anything that modifies the way that that three-dimensional structure looks from the street, it seems to me, is HPC jurisdiction if it's a historic home. Unless it's, like I said, in the back, or you're doing something that's essentially invisible to improve the house. And even there, if the HPO determines that that's going to potentially be a problem with respect to the structural integrity of the building, then you should consider whether he has a punt. And I think he should have a punt to the HPC to deal with issues that are in the gray area.
Yeah, you get the punt part. So historic preservation officer always has the ability to say, too many judgment calls, I'm not comfortable with this. So, okay. I'll try and bring better speakers next time.
Can you actually bring the microphone over to the speaker?
It's right on.
Is it? Oh, okay.
But it's not, that one is the best, that's the best mic, but it buzzes. That one right there is the best mic, but it creates this kind of horrible buzz.
Usually if it's near a phone or something,
Well, let's
Try it.
Can't get the
Here
visual.
we go. We're going to try it.
Can you get the visual back up?
Well, Todd's not.
Oh, he's not.
He's not. Yeah, please.
So are you going to hire a new person, another person?
Higher you. That's a little better. Okay. Okay, so as far as HPC goes, it's basically all other types of projects. So what we're trying to do with the historic preservation officer is catch the vast majority of sort of maintenance-oriented applications that come in the door. When you're talking about rehabilitating a home, full renovation, restoration, new construction, new outbuildings, that still comes to HPC. Does that make sense?
Yeah, do we need to add more about taking down the sheds and what you would be able to just say yes or no?
Demolition problem.
Yeah, it's not up there.
Demolition.
Yeah.
Good point.
I think we've determined that sheds don't are not part of this historic survey.
There's some of them, yeah.
Some, if I may interject, and I don't mean to be contrary, some are actually dangerous.
Oh, yeah,
The
I
shape
know.
they're in.
But we just don't have it up there at all.
So inventoried outbuildings need to be part of this. Somewhere. Yeah. I don't know. We can think it.
Thinking in, it goes to the front side, the administrator.
Yeah.
If it's dicey, then it goes dangerous.
With what Todd was talking about, with maybe there's a punt from HPO. We started with HPO. If it's visible or kind of outrageous somehow, then. But I think that Reva's point is well taken, that if we're going to deal with an outbuilding, it's got to be part of the inventory.
But we've even had where we had to say to demolition for a deck that was written.
Right.
So demolition somewhere has to be in there.
Okay. Noted. We will think more about how that fits in and discuss that for next time. So with that, we have this new it's where we're adding more authority to historic preservation officer. This is then what the process looks like. You know, you still have to, the applicant's got to review the design guidelines, look at the content, you know, actually read and answer to the actual guidelines and the standards in those. Think about the site and develop a design, submit that design to the HPO, and then there's back and forth until it looks like it's, you know, meets that appropriateness standard, and the HPO actually issues that certificate of appropriateness, and you go right to building permit. So that saves a lot of time and effort. Not just, I mean, you asked, is Ray going to hire another person? Actually, it's a lot more work for Ray to prepare for an HPC meeting than it is for him to handle an application like this. It's going to make his job actually easier if, when somebody wants to replace a window or a door, he can look at the design guidelines, look at the standards, have some back and forth with the applicant, get it right, and issue that certificate versus write an entire staff memo and go have a meeting and all that sort of stuff. So it'll actually save him time. It'll definitely save the applicant's time. And you all won't be in his many meetings. I don't know if that breaks your hearts necessarily, but they're going to be shorter and potentially fewer of them. And then there's full-blown HPC review, which is essentially still the same as it always was, where they submit an application to the HPO. The HPO writes it, reviews it, writes a staff memo. It goes to HPC, and so on and so forth. So you know how that process works. That process doesn't really change. It's just fewer kinds of applications are going to go through that process. Right now, this is where we start beating up on the existing design guidelines. There's 55 general design guidelines, 51 rehabilitation design guidelines. There's 11 neighborhoods, and I don't know if you all can keep track of them, but we actually, Susan identified them, every one of them, and it was quite the project actually. That's the staff memo thing, right, that Ray has to do. He's the one that figures out what neighborhood it's in and what that means. So we're going to talk about the neighborhoods at the very end. We will bring those up, but we're going to talk about it at the very end of this presentation. And then there's 28 pages of reference materials and background that don't really give you any information about what you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. So that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot in there. And just with that challenge alone of trying to compress that, we can definitely do better. So reorganizing the design guidelines. I mean, the real effort that we talked about is trying to revisit and update these guidelines to reflect the goals and the vision that we've created in the comprehensive plan. And more importantly, create a framework in the design guidelines that's related to what kind of applicant you are. So we're going to think about this not from the perspective of here's all of history, which is kind of how the current design guidelines are set up with the 11 neighborhoods. It sort of starts with the historic context, which is great. It's really interesting reading, but if you're trying to do something as an applicant, like, you need to read these things and find out where it is it talks about what you're trying to do. So there's sort of 3 different chapters, really, in the design guidelines. One for new construction, one for additions and outbuildings, one for rehabilitation, renovation, and restoration. Make sense? We have a new section, a new way of sort of saying, okay, this is new construction. Here's additions and new outbuildings associated with an existing structure. And then here's sort of the rules about rehabbing, renovating, and restoring existing historic structures without reference to new construction or additions, right? So this makes it a lot easier. And we want to kind of, one of the things that additional process brings from the applicant perspective is uncertainty. You just don't know how it's going to come out. And so that's more of a process thing. It's also has to do with being very clear about what you're supposed to do. It's sort of the design guidelines themselves and then the process. So that's kind of the goal for reorganizing. We want to strengthen and simplify them. We want to separate the resource materials and do this sorting process between this kind of guidance belongs in the zoning code, this kind of guidance belongs in the design guidelines. When you read the design guidelines, a lot of stuff that's in there is zoning code material. And we need to keep the zoning code stuff with the zoning code and the design guideline stuff with the design guideline. New maps and better illustrations, I think, will help articulate what it is that we expect from the applicants. And then again, setting it up so that when you're an applicant, the things are organized to sort of speak to what you're trying to do and the different kinds of applications that come in. So we actually propose chapters that speak specifically to the kinds of applications that come in. So that should be pretty easy. You have a little introduction. You say, okay, Chapter A, this is about new construction. Chapter B, this is about additions. Chapter C, this is about rehabilitation. And then ultimately, this will lead to your neighborhood district, and we're going to talk about the neighborhoods kind of last today, but we are going to talk about them and move on from there. Let's see. Oops, wrong clicker. So thinking about new construction and infill, and we defined infill before, right? It's new buildings on vacant lots, new buildings on lots that are currently underbuilt, and potentially scrape and replace for non-contributing structures. So these are interesting examples here in Central City. Prospector's not in the National Historic District. The Reserve Casino is. And the Reserve Casino is an example of new construction that to some degree mimics the historic architecture in Central City. We included this one from Prospector because although it's not in the it's not in the district, it shows you that in Central City we have allowed sort of modern flair construction. This has some historic elements to it. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it, but there's garages in front and that sort of thing. So this has actually been done here in the city limits in the past, just to sort of bring that. Someone want to read this? It's got good enough eyes. These are direct quotes out of the design guidelines. Somebody can probably see it.
The city does not seek to take the district back in time. New construction should exhibit references to historic buildings in the neighborhood and be consistent in style. In embarking on the reconstruction approach, a difficult question is determining which date to restore the district. Since the district was dynamic, even during its period of significance, selecting a date would be difficult. Some sites in Central City have had more than one structure on the site. Which of these buildings, if it were being reconstructed, would accurately express the community's heritage? This approach, therefore, is not espoused in Central City. So the new guidelines state new buildings need not imitate historic styles and forms, do not copy or mimic historic structures.
So we're showing you some of the, like, to me, this is not super clear guidance on what we're supposed to do with new construction. Or is it? I mean, you tell me.
Here's my problem, especially right down here in downtown, right here. I would hate to have super modern, which I don't like anyway, in the middle of all the historic. I mean, I would start laughing if I came to this city and saw that. You don't have to make it historic, just like the Reserve, but to put a super modern thing right in between two really historic buildings, that would look silly.
So maybe what we ought to do, and I'm curious, what others think about that. I mean, it's a real question for us. And I've got some photos that might actually help with this. But here's some considerations. One is this idea of cohesive input, right? So you're saying it's just there's got to be some cohesion to the landscape. We don't want something that's completely out of place. In the meantime, don't try to make a new building look older than it actually is. Like a new building should look relatively new. Another example, well, we have a couple other photos too. One of the important things, I think, is to complement the scale of the neighborhood and sort of the bulk height, the shape of it. And that's something that communities do that are not historic. You know, downtowns that have zero historic value, think about the scale of downtown, being very careful about that. I think providing examples is important, and then sort of providing references to those resource materials is also useful. But let's just look at a couple of photos here. So maybe I'll let Susan, you have to be really loud, but I'm going to walk through because she found some of these and has an interesting way of talking about them. Hello, Susan?
Yes, you want me to begin?
Yes. Be real loud.
Okay, I thought this example showed some compatibility and non-compatibility in some adjacent structures. The red brick building that's not quite finished in this photo, I felt was cohesive and compatible with the adjacent historic structures. It's of a similar height. The window pattern is also similar. The proportions are compatible. It uses a material that relates to elements, and materials that were historically used. But this photo also shows two additions to the buildings on the right-hand side, the tan building and the gray building. They've got some examples on the ground floor where someone has added what I would consider to be a non-compatible addition to those historic structures. So I thought this photo was of some good things that were done and some essentially not good, bad things that were done.
Do you all agree with Susan's assessment?
Yes.
What happened here? Okay, good. We'll move on to the next one.
This photograph I actually know is from Park City, and I thought for the most part these structures were compatible with one another. They have similar footprints and similar building heights. They've maintained the character of the large glass storefronts on the ground level with transoms above the display windows. Those are items that are specifically listed in the guidelines currently for Central City. This is also a good example of signs being subordinate to the building facade. Perhaps the one item that's not as compatible as the others is the deck above the front door of the building on the right-hand side.
I think everybody was nodding their heads and agreeing with you so far.
Yes.
Okay.
So we're getting on the right track here as far as cohesive input. Okay, so here's a whole nother look at it. This is Fort Collins, and they are no dummies with no lack of planners in Fort Collins. Okay, Susan, why did you put this in here?
And, the first time I saw this picture, I thought the newer building on the left-hand side was constructed in such a way that the historic structures on the right-hand side became more important. And there are some things that were done well, but there also are some things that could have been done better. You know, the new building uses an historic brick material. That's a good thing. And they did use some accents above some of the windows, a white band of stone maybe above some of the windows. And perhaps it could have been done better by using that on all of the windows.
Yeah.
It's got glass storefronts on the lower ground level, and that's a good thing. But the second floor, the windows are much more of a modern arrangement, and the third floor, the windows are much more of what you would find in a historic building.
So what do you think about this? I mean, the hypothesis here to think about is that the modern building on the left somehow adds value to the really nice historic buildings on the right.
It does?
I would agree. I would, because it makes them pop. You know, they pop out. There could have been a few elements that would have been, and I think the two key words within this discussion are cohesiveness and elements. Could there have been a few more elements that were made it a little
Well, like what she said, the bottom part in the second floor, they used the wrong windows.
And also, if they would have just used the same.
But at the end of the day, the one thing that could have been done, I agree to some degree, but also keep in mind that somebody's built that building, and that second floor is designed for some specific purpose in order to make a profit. That's whether it's attorneys or whatever. And so but when I turn my head and come back and look at it, what stands out immediately to me are these two very nice right-hand buildings.
Well, I guess it also, you know, I don't think you would do that kind of building in our downtown. Now, if it's further out, yeah, if they did a few changes to it, I can see that, but not for downtown.
So down Gregory Gulch, for example.
Yeah.
So we don't need, I mean, it sounds like you're saying we don't need to do what they did at Reserve all the way down Gregory Gulch. We could have something.
You can have either one.
With slightly different, but something like this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, if they kept that white motif over the windows in that brick building.
If they tried to insert a few historic.
Yeah. Try to gain some degree of cohesiveness, especially in the summer. And I noticed, just a point of thought real quick, I noticed the other day, I think it's on the is it the new sewer waste treatment plant that just built south of Blackhawk?
Which one?
Well, the one closest to Blackhawk. I noticed the other day as I came up the elements within that are there's elements within that kind of make it look like a mill building. You know, and they're pretty simple elements that they didn't get overbearing with it, but it's quite nice.
Okay, so far so good.
Now see, that's
Maybe we don't need Susan to even talk about this. Thumbs up or thumbs down on the one in the middle.
Thumbs down.
You like it?
for Central City. That is a laughable building.
Okay, all right, forget that one. Forget that one.
We agree.
How about this?
No.
No, even on a vacant lot up in your residential neighborhood?
I don't like modern.
Should be.
That's me.
I mean, this is a house. This is somebody's personal.
But it's modern. I don't like modern.
Okay. All right.
When you look at this, don't look at your personal.
I know.
Right.
Think
What's
of it
good for the
as
city.
within the historic district of the city.
And what worries me is if we get to,
If it's up in the mountains or outside, I don't care.
But what about all the way up on East 6th High?
Oh, like this.
So let's say there's an application for you tonight. You are sitting as an HPC, and it's an infill development of vacant lot.
I'd have a very hard time with that, because there is nothing historical about that. No.
yeah, we might lose business. We need to build this city, and I'm just afraid that I get too picky.
I think we have to really, You have to try very hard, as people said in this committee, to segregate personal preference from the good of long-term longevity of the city.
Where's the historical anything?
Well, but it has kind of a Western motif.
I think it's
kind of
cool,
like
actually.
You can go right down
Orange
to Gulch
type,
Yes,
Okay, one at a time, one at a time.
Industrial Gulch, and I get the segregation between the
Yeah,
historical.
if it's out, I don't care if they do anything.
Here has been my thing with the guidelines ever since I got on HPC before that. The way they seem to operate here in Central City goes against everything I was ever taught about preservation. That when you put an addition onto a building, you don't make it look exactly like the rest of the building. You make it different so people can tell that is a different part of the building. But here in Central City, too often, it seems to me, you make it look exactly like the rest of that, so everybody driving up here thinks that's part of that old historic building. And
That's just
so,
too long.
you know, this isn't, if we had something like this that was coming in on a vacant lot where there was nothing there at all, I think it would at least be worth considering. Or do we just build another house that somebody looks at it and goes, gee, that house must have been here for 150 years. Well, no, that house was built 2 years ago. I mean, that's just a false impression.
And sometimes the elements like this create a riot, because a younger generation, a younger set comes along and sees this and says, I like that. I would do that up there. Think how wonderful that would be. They don't necessarily want to cookie cutter house.
I mean, personally, I would never build a house like that. It's just not my style. But, you know, we're not going to build this town in 19th Street.
I just wonder what the neighbors call it when we saw that.
I'm just wondering if certain areas might be more.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying.
All the way up on the hill where we don't have
Yeah.
this built.
I'm just saying, you know, down here, it's a different thing. Out around,
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so Gabe, one of our reasons for putting this in here was that when we dig into these guidelines, can we get into the nitty-gritty a little bit about what it is that helps with that compatibility? So, you know, in listening to the discussion about, you know, maybe we want it to not mimic the historic structures, but maybe it sort of is more subdued and blends in a compatible way. In this case, Susan outlined on the right some of the things that are very different. You know, the building colors are not similar to those historic. The windows and doors are very different shapes. The exterior materials are you know, they're of this era. They're not historic at all. So maybe, you know, our thinking is that there may be ways to find this sweet spot, and we'll get into this as we keep going through the presentation, but we find a sweet spot that has the compatibility but has a little bit more flexibility in the execution.
Okay, so that's good. That was really a helpful discussion for us.
Hey, Dave, can I chime in here?
Thinking about, Todd.
Dave? Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a delay. I just want to add that with respect to new residential development in areas of existing historic small-scale single-family, that one has to be careful on the zoning side, not necessarily on the design side, to place limitations on mass and scale that are appropriate to prevent the speculation in land that makes it worthwhile to try to tear down an old house that otherwise may survive. And it's not a big deal now, but I think Central City has to anticipate another wave of serious prosperity. And at that point, you're going to have people that want to live in modern housing and look at pretty old housing. And what you may find at some point is, on balance, the success chews up the thing that made you successful in the first place. So on the zoning side, I'm going to make some proposals that help you take care in terms of mass and scale in your close-in neighborhood. And if you want to have a big mansion, maybe we want to make sure that that's placed in an area that's accessible to the city but not potentially compromising its special character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, I think, when we start weaving together the zoning code, and the design guidelines, potentially the zoning code will take care of a lot of just what would be a potentially obnoxious, out-of-place structure without us having to fuss a ton about the details. But that's all really helpful input for us. Now, thinking about additions, porches, outbuildings, we don't want to affect the overall character of the existing contributing historic structure, right? We don't want to mess that. That's kind of rule number one. But we do need a way that clearly addresses greenhouses, which is actually something that is in our history here, garages and other outbuildings. Think about compatibility with existing structures and also provide some clear guidance that is actually illustrated. So some more examples. DHM Durango, you're on deck again.
Okay. The left-hand photograph is hopefully one that everyone there recognizes. This is an example of a deck that I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is an additional porch to the historic Opera House. Also, it appears that there's an additional piece of building that was added as well.
92, the additional building.
So this is something that we definitely need to be addressing in the new guidelines. The right-hand photograph is from Durango, and I included this photograph because someone has taken what was an open front porch, and on the left-hand side of the porch, they've enclosed it, but they did it in such a way that keeps it transparent. So from the street, you're still getting the same feeling of being able to see through the porch, but yet the person has been able to enclose it and use it for living space. What do you think about these examples?
That's a very pretty house.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's a great one. Yeah.
That was my house, and I moved into a better one.
Looks like a serious roof.
Yeah.
It does. That's a good one.
That's a great one. You nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go on with some more examples.
Okay, here are two photographs of two different ways that someone addressed adding a garage to an existing historic structure. The building on the left is in the city of Aspen. The city of Aspen's take on historic preservation is if you want to add something new to an historic home, it must not appear to be replicating the historic structure in any way. They favor contemporary additions to historic structures. So that's what you're seeing on the left-hand side. The right-hand side is actually my house in Durango. A portion of my house dates to 1908. And on the right-hand side is a single-car garage was added at some point. And I just felt the materials that were chosen and the architectural details of the garage were more in keeping with the house.
So is what happened on the left, would that be okay here?
Yeah, I think I like both the right and left stuff.
Okay, so we can have flexibility that if you want to do a modern-looking garage, even if it's visible from the street, we can do that.
But even there, they made the roof line the same as the historic home, so they still did put some historic parts to it. It's not, and it's not, yeah.
Right, it looks historic to me.
Yeah.
Look at the old stuff on it.
I actually went to the Saving Places conference. I went to the garages, the history of garages presentation. Neither one of these really out of place.
Yeah, I think that's just fine.
So if the city's going to move in this direction for the design guidelines, sort of opening up for more modern style, that's just so I think aware it's a dramatic shift from where they have.
Well, we did that. Which group? The other houses. It's not a broad, but it's a hard.
That's great. I think it's great. I think we're making progress here. Okay, so principles for rehab of existing buildings. I mean, basically, this is when you get down, when you're rehabbing an existing building, we're down into the parts and pieces of it, right? This is when HPC shines. And we're trying not to mess it up. We want to end up with something that at the end of it really preserves that original feel of the structure. So, but we have some ideas about this as well. So, again, we want to provide as much clarity as we can. Century is a good example of a restoration, right? Very well, when you walk around the outside of that, that's especially this corner, is, you know, that's a real honest to goodness restoration here in Central City. But this is a different thing, and I'm going to let DHM Durango talk about these next couple. There are kind of restorations with additions, but this is the kind of restoration for a commercial structure that you might have people proposing to do.
When I found this photo, I immediately thought of the warehouse district. These appear to be two warehouses. I don't know where these are. However, they've done several things to these structures that your guidelines currently do not support. They expanded the amount of window on the lower levels. In the guidelines, they're calling that open surface. And your current guidelines discourage opening up and adding more window to a building that historically would not have had that type of window on the first floor. They've also added a third floor addition here. It's stepped back, but it's using much more modern and contemporary materials. And the current guidelines do not support that type of addition to a structure either.
So there's sort of two things to think about here. One is what happened on the ground floor there, and two is this third floor addition. Those are kind of two different things to think about. And it is one building, but we kind of need guidance on both of those, and we have another photo to help with it a little bit. But just what's your take? I mean, let's start with the third floor addition that's stepped back.
Well, you're still looking at the zone and the height.
Yeah. But height would allow 3 stories in the historic.
Huge story.
So the question was posed, if that building is currently contributing to the national register in that addition on top of it, I would imagine that it would fall off that status and no longer be contributing.
Yeah, I would have a hard time, especially like that. I would have a hard time.
So then the question kind of going back to the other photo in the garage is the difference commercial versus residential. Should we be looking for residential infill development versus commercial downtown changes? Is that outlined?
But again, in an additional building in the garage, there you have effective steps. Where this, that will,
Hey, Gabe, can you help convey the conversation?
Yeah.
We can't quite hear.
Yeah, that's okay. The discussion is that the third story addition here may jeopardize the contributing status of the historic structure.
Uh-huh. And is it because of just the height or because of the contemporary style, or both?
I think it's that much alteration. So nobody's super definitive on it, but it's an issue that's
Has it not already potentially been done to some degree already on the social club, on the Nitro building? At the north end of it, they actually went up the third floor.
Yeah, but they didn't make it like
No,
that.
I agree. But I'm simply saying, I think there's already some degree of precedent that's been set on more than one building, including the current Doc-Holiday building, where these additional levels have already been done. Now, this one to me is glaring. I will agree with you. But I think you've already set a precedent in regards to it.
Well, like I said, it depends on the zone and what you're wanting to be able to do.
Yeah, something like this I can see actually being done on the Junkins McKay. If they set it back and it wasn't as glaring, perhaps, but opening up on a third level on that building where actually you wouldn't see it from the street level.
This is a rather extreme example, I think.
Yeah.
But,
so maybe we ought to look at the next one.
Yeah, Gabe, show them the next one.
So let's look at this one. This is Cripple Creek.
Looks good.
You want to? Well, we're just looking at it, I think. But this is the same kind of deal. You've got a step back third story, so it's done a little bit more in line. That is a third story. That's not a
Well,
fourth.
just like the last picture, they just would have put brick over it and around it, I think, then it
Right.
blend.
Again, if you go back to cohesive and elements as your kind of key descriptive words within proposed third-story structure, I think that it needs to be, to me, that the other photograph was not cohesive to that.
Well, I don't think there's a problem with third floors, because we have a lot of our buildings are 3 floors here down in downtown. I think what we're talking about, and what I hear from everyone, is that first one. You know, that's just,
If it were brick and the windows smaller, it would
fit in.
Okay, so simple little things. Now then with the step back, because what they've done there in Cripple Creek is you can see they've preserved the original facade. And that's why they probably either A, did that on purpose or were required to do that. And that's, so you can have that. And also it's, when you're on the street, you don't see that step back.
You don't see it.
So is that something that we like, is that idea of the step back? Yeah. Okay, good.
One thing I would say about Main Street here, 2 things. The Doc Holiday, a good chunk of the Doc Holiday building.
Yeah.
The Rose Haven building is a building that's what it means. But I also, at the Saving Places Conference, went to the Main Street presentation, Main Street meets modern, whatever it was called. And they said there are very few intact main streets from kind of the Victorian era. And the guy who was doing the presentation was from Illinois, and one street that he singled out was Central City's Main Street. That's sort of this intact late 19th century group of storefronts. So I think when it comes to Main Street, we want to be really careful.
About going to this kind of bulk.
Yeah, we want to keep it.
Well,
So
you know, with the contributing status and just everything, I think we want to be really careful. Just on Main Street with what we.
So did you guys hear that, DHM Durango?
Can you repeat it? Oh, we heard part of it.
So the comment was that on Main Street here, we want to be really careful about what we do there. Even so, this Cripple Creek thing might be starting to push the envelope a little bit on Main Street. That was the comment.
Did Scarlett's fit in your mind? 130 Main Street to the rest of Main Street?
I mean, it works pretty well.
Well, I'm curious what's everybody's position on this one.
That doesn't bother me.
Because that looked pretty good.
To me, it looks pretty good.
But most of our buildings are already 3 floors.
I agree it looks good. I
think it's well modern.
my concern would be what it would do with the contributing status of the old buildings with
So the integrity of Main Street may be
And the
less flexible than when you get away from Main Street?
We just have to be careful about what it means for contributing status. I think that comes back. I mean, there isn't a lot of objection to the way that that looks, but there's a caution flag out for it.
So is it simply, it is allowed, but there's these guidelines?
Yeah.
It's still under review. It still has to be reviewed.
Yeah.
Okay. They modernize that a lot, because of all the
I think from this distance, I totally agree. I think if you're walking down the street, I would think
You would never see it, especially if the streets are so close together. Flying in.
Okay, so we're gonna shift gears. That was a lot of fun, and thank you for the good input on it. Now we have to talk about the table of contents. We're gonna let Susan do this as well.
This is the current table of contents from the existing guidelines, just for reference. On the next slide are some proposed markups to show how we might revise the guidelines. The guidelines are very lengthy. It took me many hours to read them all. One of the most important things that I took from my first reading was some continuously running page numbers from start to finish would really be helpful. There are some items at the beginning of the current guidelines that we felt could be moved to a separate document. Those include the history of the Central City chapter, the discussion of the present character of the city, and the future character of the city. In the end, we felt keeping the description of the different architectural styles of the city were important to keep in the guidelines for reference and ease of use. Let's see. Currently, there's an introduction. We're still going to need something. Maybe we can condense it. And there's a whole section on goals. And the goals more appropriately belong in the comprehensive plan. There's also discussion in the current guidelines about process, and that is more appropriately located in the zoning code. We already discussed earlier that we would move any references to landscaping to the zoning code, and I think we were in agreement on that. There's also a chapter on streetscape in the current guidelines, and those are more appropriately located in the zoning code as well.
Mm-hmm.
We're still going to need to
Susan, define the streetscape jargon term for us.
The current guidelines talk about the street lighting and the site furniture and those kinds of things. That's what they were describing for the streetscape.
Yeah, so that's streetscape. It's like on-street lighting, the benches, the signage, that sort of thing.
I think Todd was trying to chime in. Maybe?
No, I'm sorry?
I thought I heard you trying to comment.
No, I wasn't trying to chime in, but I'm happy to chime in if you need.
Okay.
We don't need. You keep going, Susan.
No, okay. Let's see. We discussed earlier about reorganizing the guidelines by the type of project that you're going to be coming forward with, having a chapter for new construction, having a chapter for additions and porches and outbuildings, and then having a separate third chapter for rehabilitation. Then on the right-hand side are all the different chapters of all the different neighborhoods that are in the existing guidelines. And I'm proposing to streamline that. Instead of having 11 different potential neighborhoods you would be in, I think I've got it down to maybe 5 or 6.
Okay, so that's the rundown of what these design guidelines might look like once we get through them. Then you've got the appendix, with all the reference material that we're going to need. You know, keep the useful stuff. You can read the history of Central City all over the world, but including the stuff that actually matters for an applicant trying to figure out how to comply. We talked about the different things that the zoning code is going to cover, and these are all things that are peripherally covered in the design guidelines right now. Stormwater, I mean, the design guidelines.
I need some education. When you say zoning code, I'm kind of surprised that streetscape isn't in.
It's that it's not in there now?
No, that it is. How do you want to move it?
Well, because the reason that it's in there is if you're, I mean, primarily, it's in the more just the development code. If you're going to build something new, say you're going to build something down the street from the reserve. I'm trying to imagine that you could actually do that right now. But now there's a sidewalk that goes all the way down, past the reserve, all the way along in front of that. The streetscape guidelines would say, thou shalt continue that sidewalk. And then furthermore, here's what you do with your landscaping, signage, that sort of thing. So, you know, like streetscape might actually cover things like, well, the sign code covers the signs, but it would cover anything that you see that's dominant, that's kind of part of the right-of-way, and then what's sort of immediately adjacent to it. And that is typically something that the land development code covers because you're talking about new development. And you wouldn't necessarily, it wouldn't start applying if you're like remodeling your house or something like that. But if you're doing something new, then we talk about how that relates to the street and how the street comes out in that development code.
So there's going to be different zones and have different aspects under that zone that is required for that particular code.
Well, that may actually be under a different, you know, general development standards that would be kind of broadly applicable, and they may change.
Like fencing?
Yeah, some things are going to be tied to the zoning districts, like the parking requirements, and other things are going to be more general design standards and part of a subdivision, set of subdivision regs. So, but it typically is covered. These are all things that are today covered in the design guidelines, and they shouldn't. These should be. These are most commonly covered in the development code. So we need to move those things out. It's not, we're not giving them up. We're just moving them into a place where they actually belong. And then thinking about the order of the standards that kind of respond to the procedural tracks, like starting with the things, and you know, this is one cut at it, but starting with the things that are kind of the most common or most commonly encountered for somebody reading through the design guidelines, just kind of like the way Todd was talking, sets up the zoning code. So the most important stuff is at the top, and as you get down toward the bottom, you're in more and more details. So that's another sort of thing in terms of organization. The neighborhoods, this is our last topic. The neighborhoods, there really are a lot of them. I just have a general question. So here's the idea with the neighborhoods basically is to more align them with the zoning districts and the land use designations in the comprehensive plan, because they kind of like, they're their own thing and there's really too many of them. But we don't want to, you know, we want to group the neighborhoods where it makes sense to group them, and where we really do need to retain an existing neighborhood to inform the design guidelines, we do that. But we certainly don't want to be repeating design guidelines, because that's what we found is that You've got your general design guidelines, and then you have other stuff in the neighborhood design guidelines that is kind of like what's in the general design guidelines, and sometimes it's not. So we want to make sure that what ends up in the neighborhood specific design guidelines is actually important and actually only applies to that neighborhood. So how many of you all in HPC, like how important are the neighborhoods in your review process? Just out of curiosity. Like, do you think about, do you spend a lot of time thinking?
So the stack reports at the end of the stack reports are cite the neighborhood guidelines. And generally, the neighborhood guidelines are almost exactly the same for all the various neighborhoods. Very subtle changes if there's any changes.
Do we, well, we can go through it real quick, but I'm tempted to ask whether we ditch it entirely. Just before I even...
Because we go by national register.
So you don't see a lot of utility in...
The only time it comes into play would be if you have a, say you want a new development that's coming in, and a lot of times it ties in with the other architecture in your interior design, and so by looking at the neighborhood, you can see how that is linked on the architecture that's designed. How the overall area was, and how it was set up, and that plays into the decision. If you don't think there's any value in having looking at the overall neighborhood in a separate section in the design plan, you just look at the overall plan on which is.
I wondered if Ray, what Ray was saying, DHM, was, you know, one of the ways that the neighborhoods get used is as a delineator to talk about when we say the character of the overall neighborhood, this is what we mean. And so we kind of, there's actually something that's mapped that says this is the neighborhood. My question is, do we need to have delineated neighborhoods to be able to do that? Like, is that a helpful tool to have them actually delineated? Because here's a map of them right here.
Do you guys remember reviewing the house going in on? That's what I was just thinking. Yeah. So it's just.
Mr. Chia.
What was that? What was the?
It's not constructed yet. It's under construction maybe this year, but it was approved most recently as a new home build, and since it was in Eureka, that neighborhood, it had some different requirements. It wasn't. We weren't looking to have a Victorian house there, but
okay.
We have a stone house there. We have. Wooden, it was
by Barrett
rustic,
Street.
more rustic looking than.
Right.
They made it fit.
There was no
It
milk
so
house or something.
Kind of having what the neighbor, wherever it is, it does kind of help in looking at the style.
Okay. Okay. So I'm not.
Maybe there should be some condensing.
Yeah.
So maybe there's not 6 or 7, maybe there's 4 sections.
Couldn't we just maybe give a blanket statement that says kind of respect
It
the
has
area
to
you're
be.
building in?
It has to be.
Well, that's what I was kind of wondering. I mean, because here we'll just flip through them really quick. I mean, you've got your commercial core. That's but the commercial core is in zoning code too, right? It's a zone district. Commercial transitional, which is kind of like part of the commercial core, so that's one that we were thinking we would merge.
Right.
The warehouse district has got some unique elements to it. And so we'll just kind of flip through these really quick and then take that discussion back up. There's your warehouse district. This is where we talk about the potential for those open surface guidelines might be too restrictive. So there's some different considerations, I think. For this one in particular, it's one of the ones that actually kind of makes sense. Gregory Gulch. Yeah, I mean, that, like when you're trying to think about blending in with that neighborhood, I don't know what you're trying to do exactly, but but it is it's unique in that sense. But maybe maybe it more aligns with our comp plan designation, which basically goes all the way from the historic commercial port down to Blackhawk. It's one area functional. And then we get into these neighborhoods, Packard, Kavala, Eureka Street, which does have, Eureka Street has kind of more standalone, unattached, freestanding historic structures.
Right.
And so that's different, So maybe that's one of the ones that we thought about. And Susan, I'm blasting through these, so cut in if I miss any kind of subtleties here.
Okay.
This might be, we just talked about Eureka Street, so maybe, this may be something that it's grouped with another area, but I don't know. We'll have to kind of think about that more. Spruce Street,
215.
yeah. Then you've got your hillside, north side residential neighborhoods. Like a lot of these are kind of one, like Kavala and all that. I don't know that we treat those differently than the hillside neighborhoods.
So you're trying to determine if you can condense some of these together. Is that?
That's what we're working on, yeah. Like basically any historic residential neighborhood that's on a steep hill, that kind of becomes one character.
When they developed these, they had a vision that, okay, well, this gaming thing's going to go crazy, and okay, so we're going to kind of break these up into what we will allow in certain areas and what we won't.
What they did, if you read them, what they did is they dissected how this town was developed and when. Like they did hard research to define these neighborhoods. And so I think what we need to do is step back from them, think functionally about what we're talking about. And I think for DHM Durango, one of the things that's come out is that whole Eureka Street corridor we need to think about differently because it does have a different development pattern. I don't know if you all agree with the warehouse district. It's just a little neighborhood, but it's so unique and there's so much potential over there. So anyways, we're going to rethink these neighborhoods. And it won't be the last time that you get to, Spring Street's a little different, but it's not that much different than the other hillside neighborhoods. It's just not quite as steep. It's not quite as ridiculously steep as the other ones. So that kind of covers that. We're going to group a bunch of those together, make it easier to deal with. This is just a thing to make sure that we didn't forget to talk about anything. We did talk about everything except for views. Okay, so the design guidelines right now talk about views in an odd way. They talk about views from each other's houses. Yeah, which I don't know. I mean, it says like views of mountains and landscapes and landmarks, and it's so unclear what view we're talking about from where. And so when I read it, I got thoroughly irritated with it and said, why would we do this? Why would we, in the design guidelines, talk about protecting one neighbor's view from the other one when we have these teeny little lots that are where they are? And so I don't know whether it would bother you. My thinking was, if I was keying, I would just say, yank that out of there. Let's not talk about that. Do we have agreement on that, or do we want to be in that business?
The alternative is to look at specific olive view sheds where it's very visible and that into discussion.
But that would be sort of part of the land use code. Like build a ridiculous house that breaks a ridge line. Yeah, maybe we don't want that. But just in terms of, right now it opens the door where somebody can come in to one of your meetings and say, there's this section on views and this person's building their house to the north of me and I want to be able to see to the north. What are you going to do about it, HPC? So I think we just get out of that business.
I also agree because
Yeah, I agree. I know exactly, I already have a list of questions. But on that, on the views, there's actually views from, like some of the combining corners you guys are talking about, from Gregory Gulch to combining that. There's views of historical places from actual people's houses. So like from Bay Street, you can see some of the Bates Mine and the Shaft houses. So it's not necessarily views of the landscape, there's actually views of historical places. So if someone throws up something, so that's what kind of way I interpret that. Because when certain parts of the city, not necessarily Eureka or anything like that, but when you start getting closer to Black Hawk, and did some research on how they view their stuff, they really do bring out historical places. And since we do want to talk about people touring and visiting historical places, I do think that Central City we kind of messed up with not really emphasizing our historical places as prominent. So cutting those things out of our design guidelines, cutting those kinds of landmark and Bates Hill differentiated from certain places, I think in the long run we need to leave in history, even though it sounds trivial on design guidelines. But we have a lot of reminiscent streets, we have a lot of people that don't even know where our homes are. So that's where I was kind of confused on taking out views. It's not necessarily about houses and streets, it's about views of historical places or things that actually make sense.
I don't believe so. I don't believe that's what that, when you get a legal point of view in regards to views within this document, I don't believe that's what pertains to it. I think it's a can of worms.
Yeah, it's not about getting rid of the things that you have the view of. It's the way that they're written right now. It's when you build a structure, it's super vague on if you build that structure, it sort of like opens up the door to saying, okay, you built this house next door to mine. I used to have this view to the north, and now I don't have it anymore. But there's a platted lot right there.
But is there a way that you can put that in there pertaining? I'm just asking. Is there a way that you can put in there pertaining to the structures that are actually historical views or landmarks in the city?
Well, it's the same. I think it's the same can of worms.
So that's what.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I think it's a can of worms in that the development pattern is kind of already set here. There are property rights associated with any vacant lot, and then say, there's potential to sort of expand in certain parts of the hillside neighborhoods. Okay, well that right now looks like grassed hillside, but that's actually private property that could be developed for housing, which is something that we need here. So I'm not saying that, I'm not necessarily arguing against it, I'm just asking, like, do we want to be in this business? And the reason that I got irritated with it was not because I don't care about views, it's just thinking about the city being in that business of protecting an individual's view from development that might happen adjacent to it. I just think that's a can of worms.
I just think I live for views. Honestly, I really do. Bought my house because of the view. However, I also understand that the vacant lots across the road from me are private property, and somebody's going to build them.
And you knew when you bought the house, there's a chance.
Yeah. And look somewhere else or something.
Most cities don't want to be in that can of worms. Typically when developments are done, or when you buy a piece of property in the city, if you're that concerned, typically you're going to try and take another piece of property.
Or by the ocean.
I mean, but they don't typically, well, no, necessarily.
But where I live, it's not for blocks. There's 3 lots next to me that all intersect. So that's what I'm saying, but that's where the can of worms can happen. Well, not in a perpendicular block that goes like this. Where my house is, they go like this.
I get it, but at the end of the day, you're asking the city to be the manager of it. And I don't think that's a business you will be.
And we already have in the zoning and everything, the height.
Right. There's already guidelines that are quite specific. But what that asks you to do as a city is to be manager or a judge, if you wish.
And I'm concerned also about the development of Gregory Gulch, because if you've seen in the photo, it doesn't look very pretty. And if we have views in there, I've heard from people that they drive up to Central City Gregory Gulch is dark, it's foreboding, they're afraid they're going to drop into the hole.
Yeah,
I mean,
scary.
For a female, I don't think you'd want to walk up in it.
We want to develop that without an individual like certain people who live there saying, well, you can't build that, you can't build that, because I like that view of the hole in the ground. So I agree that we should take out views.
But Ray did mention that there's another component of this that we have not thrown off the table in the development code, where we're thinking about broader views from public rights of way, where instead of thinking about views as something that we're protecting from one private individual to another, we identify public viewpoints and think about those views from those important points as kind of a public resource, and have ways to mitigate non-reflective materials, setback off of the ridge line, that sort of thing, for those kind of things. So we're not throwing it out completely. Any final?
There's a big silent Hollywood, so it's Central City. No.
Any final thoughts? You think we're on the right track here? That's really what we're trying to test here. We have a lot of ideas.
I like taking a lot of that junk out of there.
Thank you.
Because it's hard on us.
Yeah, I bet.
Some of it's just metal over.
Yeah.
It is too much there.
The only two things I was looking at is aligning certain amounts of the districts, and both the record goals, and registry will not make sense. No one's going to get lost if they, in that. It's just when the only gray area is when we get out of the perpendicular kind of and move where Casey Street stops, and then we go to that last section where Mountain City was, and we're moving to Blackhawk. There, that is a whole puddle of intersecting lines, it's not perpendicular. So it's not as set as the rest of the city. So that's my house is city. I walk 2 feet up the back and I said, I go next door to the city. But all the intersections here. So when you have perpendicular, or glass, and you start getting, I think they don't say it's really good at views and views are just horrible.
So we...
Barbara has wanted to talk for the last 5 minutes.
Sorry, Barbara.
Blind one voice at a time. I'm an old teacher. I know that if somebody wants to build on the lots across from my house, and there are quite a few, and I get notification that this is going to come in front of you, and I have an opportunity to say, hey, I don't like it because it blocks my view to the hills, or I could listen to your conversation and say, hey, that's going to be okay, because I'm on the dark side of the hill, and I have snow in my yard till mid-May, whereas the other houses are different, and I want to give people opportunities to build there. So I know when you have a house near a opposition or whatever, near me. So that would entangle the views, and we don't necessarily have to.
And like I said, the zoning, they're taking over a lot of the stuff that wasn't got height.
Right.
Fencing and street, whatever you call it.
Streetscape, yeah.
Streetscape and stuff like that. So that's a great thing for us. So I think that takes it, and we have a built, height ceiling on a lot of the zones. So that's going to take care of some of a lot of that.
The thing that I think we're trying to do is we're trying to bring people into Central City, not
Here.
That's
right.
Yeah, right. This Main Street is just incredible.
Yes.
The city's incredible.
And we don't, in Main Street thing, until before this, they have the Main Street thing, we didn't do it right. Because people, that's why I live up here now, is my folks used to bring me up there, and I remember the taffy shops, the wine shops, the candy stores, I remember all that stuff. And people still stop me and they go, well, why don't you guys have the rock shower?
I did you. Absolutely. Yeah, breaks your heart.
And I used to come to the Belvedere in the 70s for a sandwich and a movie and dancing. And,
you wouldn't believe how many people stop me and they want to see the Belvedere because that's where they got married.
Oh.
A lot of people got married.
No, they don't have to, it'll just take time.
So we did, DHM actually recorded this. I don't know how enormous of a file it's going to be, but so
Well, how
you
do
asked for
you
that.
think? How do you think?
You'll be able to hear most of it. You'll be able to hear me. 'Cause
No,
it's
I
loud.
really like this that we were talking about. We built that really well. So I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense.
From an outsider, when I read through the current guidelines, it's very negative. It's very negative. There's not very little positive in it. It's kind of like no, no, no. And so by streamlining it and
Making it simpler.
simplifying, giving the ability to interact with one individual on a relatively easy basis is quite appealing.
Well, the other thing too is one of the problems we've had when we talk about it. We find lately we've been getting a lot of people coming before us that have already done the work, and then they had to come to us because we found it.
Yeah.
And we're hoping if we can make this more streamlined,
And people will
Exactly.
Absolutely.
they don't have a problem coming to us.
Right.
Right.
What we had in the past, just way in the past, was a little brochure that said, you know, if you want to change colors, if you want to do this. And this has to be prepared by you, given to the realtor, and the realtor, when he sells his property, says this is the process. This will stop the, hey, I didn't know. You know,
That's a
that's
great
what
idea.
I'm supposed
Thank
to
you.
do. And Main Street Central City, our group was trying to bring that about because, like you say, I remember my neighbor painting the house one way and they had to change the colors. They painted it the way they wanted to, but it didn't fit the color combination.
But
So-
we need something that will not make people not come to us when they need to.
So it should be a proactive
Yeah,
process.
it needs to be proactive.
Thank you. I thank you.
All right. Well, we got another one in April. Should we look up real quick when the next one is?
No, March.
We have one. We have a zoning meeting in March, and then we have the next time that we meet on the design guidelines is we have a lot of work to do before we come back and talk to you because we're actually going to have draft work here. So we're talking April 11th. So March 22nd is the next land use code. The next one after that would be April 10th. The next HPC Design Guidelines meeting is April 11th.
All right.
So thank you for coming tonight. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Is that on the internet?
Bye, you guys.
Is that scheduled on the internet?
I think
So
so.
it could be in at one page.
I think it's posted.
I saw you washing lips.
Bye, you guys.
Guess you gotta go to meeting.
All right.